Joining us, MS Now investigative reporter Mark Santia, MS Now Justice and intelligence reporter Ken Delaney, and executive director at the Soufan Center, Colin Clark. So, Mark, a lot scarier than I think any of us initially realized.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. Saturday, talking to law enforcement sources, initially they thought this was just a smoke bomb. This wasn't a big deal. It didn't go off. We had heard that from multiple people on the ground. That quickly changed when they had the testing back. And you're looking at on your screen one of the devices there in the criminal complaint that was unsealed a short time ago. They spoke about those devices. That was described by the FBI, Katie, as the size of a mason jar. They each had an attached fuse. They had nuts and bolts attached to the exterior surrounded by duct tape, and TATP, an explosive, was found. Police say both devices that were found just a short distance from Gracie Mansion could have been deadly. We're also learning more about the two men from Pennsylvania who made the trip here to New York City, the police commissioner said, specifically for that protest. In the criminal complaint, both men at the scene made references. One of the men made references to ISIS. There's also, according to the complaint, both men refer to ISIS in their statements, and they waive their Miranda rights. The FBI said one of the men, Amir Balat, wrote on a piece of paper that he, quote, pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. Qayoumi also allegedly said he watched ISIS propaganda on his phone. And Balat, Katie, also said and stated, quote, that they wanted to carry out an attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing, which Balat noted only caused 3 deaths. Katie?
So, Mark, the mayor was not with the police commissioner today. Again, this was outside of his residence, but he was with the commissioner earlier today. What has he been saying about this?
Yeah, we were at that press conference earlier this morning outside Gracie Mansion. That's where the mayor lives with his wife. They were not at the location. They weren't home when this incident happened. They were in Brooklyn at an event at a museum over in Brooklyn. They weren't there. The mayor spoke out about the violence, spoke out about the two men who came there with the intention to cause harm. The mayor also spoke quite a bit about the police officers, Katie, New York's finest, 2 officers who ran up to those IEDs, didn't know if they would explode, didn't know what they were. But those officers ran up to those IEDs, secured them, while other officers immediately took the 2 men into custody. And the mayor spoke quite a bit about them and gave them quite a bit of praise this morning outside of his home.
All right. So, Ken Delaney, and one of the other pieces of news that's been going around today that is relevant with this is a terror memo that has not been released down to local law enforcement from the federal government regarding what might happen in the aftermath of this war in Iran.
Yeah, and there are really 2 strands here because there's no evidence that this particular attempted attack has anything to do with the war in Iran. In fact, ISIS and Iran are not on the same page ideologically. But so this incident is a reminder, though, that there are still dangerous people in the land who have pledged allegiance to ISIS. And we got really lucky here. They decided to go and mount an attack at an anti-Muslim protest in New York City, perhaps the best staffed counterterrorism organization in the United States, in the NYPD, and they used devices that didn't go off. But these were clearly, if you read this complaint, these were people who are ideologically devoted, by their own words, to ISIS, 18 and 19 years old. It's not clear whether they were self-radicalized, whether they had any outside influences. You heard the commissioner refuse to answer that question. But this is a very alarming development here at a time when the FBI has bled resources, counterterrorism resources. Dozens and dozens of FBI agents with deep counterterrorism experience have left the Bureau in the last year. Now, on this other story that you mentioned, there is a notion, there was a bulletin, according to reports, warning about a potential uptick in threats based on the Iran war, and the White House has prevented that bulletin from being issued. These are run-of-the-mill Homeland Security unclassified bulletins that go out to law enforcement. And there's a perception among a lot of people I talk to that the White House does not want to emphasize the idea that what they've done in mounting this attack on Iran has increased the terror threat at home. But that is exactly what has happened, whether they put this bulletin out or not. Anybody who studies this issue knows that. And again, it's coming at a time when the FBI has disarmed itself in terms of its counterterrorism expertise. So a lot of people I talk to in this community are very, very concerned about the months ahead, Katie.
So listen, the NYPD and the counterterrorism unit and the JTTF here in New York City, as you said, are well-staffed, well-funded, and just the best in the business. Other law enforcement agencies around this country don't have that same staffing or that same insight or an intelligence arm even. So if they are losing out on a bulletin like this, what specifically are they losing out on? What sort of information is usually contained in these bulletins?
Well, I got to be honest. These DHS bulletins, these unclassified bulletins go out to law enforcement, are generally based on media reporting. They're pretty dumbed down. Sometimes they're based on intelligence, but they're so, because they're unclassified, they're so vague that they're not always terribly helpful, other than to sort of warn people, which they should already know, that we are in a heightened threat environment and sort of perhaps suggest some things to watch for. But look, we rely on the FBI to be the vanguard against a complex terrorist attack in the United States, particularly people motivated by overseas influences like ISIS or potentially state-sponsored by Iran. And so that's the organization, and they know full well what the threat is. The question is, do they have the staffing? Do they have the expertise anymore to do what they've done for years, which is to stop these threats before they germinate into a real attack, Katie?
So, Colin, Iran's been backed into a corner. I was talking with Secretary Panetta the other day and asked about the threat of terrorism here, the threat of sleeper cells. He said it's a real threat, which I take pretty seriously coming from the former director of the CIA. What sort of things should we be on the lookout for? What sort of things is Iran capable if they have nothing to lose?
Yeah, well, I wrote about this for an essay in The Atlantic on Saturday morning, and I laid out exactly what the concerns are. Ken is right in saying that there's a lot of differences between Iran and the Islamic State, but there's also some similarities, and that's how they can go about perpetrating attacks. There's the inspired version, which is what we saw with ISIS in New York City. It potentially could be what we saw in Austin, Texas last week with Iran. There's also what we call virtually operated or kind of remote controlled, where the entity is getting in touch with people and kind of instructing them on what targets to look for, how to build explosive devices. And then there's directed, which is where they're trained and kind of dispatched or deployed, or in the case of Iran, they're sent years ahead of time as sleeper cells. And I think that's a real major concern right now. The conflict is existential for Iran. And so if there was ever a time that they were going to use these sleeper cells, it would be now.
What sort of networks do we know that they have here in the U.S.?
Well, there's been numerous individuals from Lebanese Hezbollah arrested over the years in the United States for casing targets, especially in New York. We've seen Rockefeller Center, Times Square, the Brooklyn Bridge. They've cased numbers of targets, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, looking for target selection. And we know that they have a long-standing fundraising network through criminal activities throughout North America.